parks in Henrico County. I think it's particularly important for this group to be aware of that cooperation with Henrico County.
Yes, thanks for pointing that out, Catherine. A lot of great news from Capital Region Land Conservancy in the last few days. So thank you for calling our attention to that. And thank you, whichever fellow steering committee member hit the record button. I told you I would forget. So thank you for doing that. Anybody else have any updates to share? All right, if not, then let's see, do we have an update? Did you want to give an update from Route 5 corridor?
I'll take a little. There's just a lot happening on the Route 5 corridor right now. There is a planning commission hearing on a very large project to impact what is now ag field, and so the community's pretty involved in that one. There's just a lot happening. I don't know how anybody on staff or in the community can keep up with all the activity out in this area. So we've got our eye on the Route 5 Corridor Coalition has their eye on that project. HCAN doesn't weigh in typically on individual zoning projects. Well, we certainly haven't yet at this point. Not to say that we couldn't if we decided to do that. And then Bland, did you want to add anything to that? We can't hear you. Yeah.
I don't think so.
Okay, well, the planning commission meeting is Thursday night at 7, and anybody who's interested in what's going on with the Arcadia project could contact Aileen or Bland on that, because they're both part of the Route 5 Corridor Coalition. And Amory, should I go ahead and take this Greater Sampson 23150?
Yes, please. Thank you.
I'm in the northern part of the Varina district, which is almost like another country. When you think about how all our West End districts are nested up, all one next to another, and in a, if you will, crowded West End. And we've got so much out here in Varina. I'm in the northern part of that. So we have a group, Greater Sampson 23150, and we are waiting with bated breath to find out what Dominion is going to recommend for their new transmission line to feed Facebook. Almost certainly they're going to have to use private land and perhaps eminent domain to get that. They are planning on filing with the State Corporation Commission by the end of the year. So it's kind of, we're checking the docket. I haven't today, so hopefully nothing has happened, but this is something that this community is particularly organized around. So if you're interested in that, you can get back to me. Thank you, because I know I saw a neighbor on the call. Hi, Sharon. Very good with that. So that's all I have for Greater Sampson 23150.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Lynn. We will move on to committees. We were hoping to have a climate action committee report. This Beth has not joined us yet, but I think we can just say in general that this week we had meetings, I believe, with all of the supervisors. Is that correct, Lynn? Last week?
For sure.
Did we meet with all of them, or there's still a few outstanding?
Mr. Brannon is last. He is right before Christmas, like the 21st or 22nd in that week, very much at the end of the year. But everybody else is in the bag, if you will. They've been spoken with and talked with, and it's been very productive. Thanks.
Yeah, those have been great meetings, and Beth and her committee and the student police fabulous job of engaging with the supervisors, and have had some great discussions, a lot of great information sharing. So we're really pleased with how that's been rolling along. All right, well, that I believe is all we have before we can go right into our presentation about Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Tim, I believe you are going to introduce our speaker. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct. I would like to welcome Gabby Troutman. She is the Virginia Crossroads, grassroots manager for Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And Gabby and I have worked together in a lot of aspects, but I'm a clean water captain, and Gabby and I interact on that as we work on trying to clean up the bay and keep it healthy. So anyway, Gabby is going to talk to us about cleaning up the water and keeping it clean, particularly in James River, going through Henrico for us, and then also all the way down to the bay. So Gabby, thank you for coming, and kick it off.
Thank you. I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen. Bear with me for 1 second. Can you confirm that you're seeing my slide screen? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And I'll just say that you'll have to bear with my voice a little bit, that I finally have it back. I was sick for a few weeks, so I had lost my voice. So it has been going in and out over the last few days, but I think it's finally good. So I'm really happy to be with you all this evening to talk about Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the health of the bay itself, and a more local focus on the James River. And my computer is taking a minute to decide that it wants to be on the same page as me. I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, so first off, I wanted to start with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and tell you a little bit about our organization if you're not familiar with us. CBF believes in working in a few different areas. So we have an education team who work on informing students as well as educators. And we are passionate about that topic because we really believe that it's important to start off with students and educate them on the environment. And our education team believes it's best to teach people about the bay by being out on the water. We educate tens of thousands of students and teachers each year, and we have immersive field experiences and professional development courses that our education team works on throughout the summer season as well as during the school year. We also have a very large restoration program at CBF. CBF performs hands-on restoration work with our community partners across the watershed to reduce pollution at its source, and we rebuild the bay's natural filters, which are oyster reefs, forests, and wetlands. Those efforts are to improve water quality in both the bay and its rivers and streams, as well as to protect shorelines, provide habitat for fish and wildlife, cool cities, and increase our resilience to climate change. We also work a lot with farmers as well as on restoring oyster reefs, planting trees, and other programs in urban areas. We also focus pretty heavily on advocacy, especially here in our Richmond office. Across CBF, we work at the local, state, and federal level for science-driven laws and regulations to reduce pollution, focusing on restoring vital natural systems like oyster reefs and forests, and encouraging smart growth within our communities in suburban and urban areas. We also engage many community members like you in our advocacy work, and we have a dedicated team of advocates who Tim mentioned, our clean water captains, who work really closely with us to promote responsible policies, especially in the upcoming General Assembly session. And when all of those things fail, we also have a really excellent team of lawyers who lead our litigation efforts. CBF works to defend the laws and regulations that protect waterways, and we serve as a watchdog organization to hold governments and polluters accountable on bay restoration commitments, and have some very carefully chosen legal action to ensure that those things are being followed through on. So I wanted to just touch on some really basic watershed information for those of you who aren't aware. We live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. It is the largest estuary in North America and the third largest in the world. And if you're not familiar with what a watershed is, it just simply refers to a landmass where all of the precipitation that falls on land drains to the same body of water. So you can see in this map the entire watershed. So anybody living in that strip of New York or Pennsylvania or West Virginia, their rivers and streams are going to flow to the bay just the same as the James River will here in Richmond. And an estuary is a body of water where you have fresh and salt water mixing. So you can see that we have all of the fresh water from our major streams draining into the bay, and the bay opens up to the Atlantic Ocean, where we have salt water coming into the bay. So the salinity level is very different from the northern end to the southern end as those waters mix together. The bay also has the largest land to water ratio of any estuary in the world, which means there's a lot of land draining into a relatively small body of water, which makes it particularly sensitive to our actions on land. The good news is that shallow water gives the bay a really high potential for productivity because sunlight can penetrate down the water column pretty far, and it can nourish underwater grasses, which provide oxygen, food, and shelter for crabs, fish, and other organisms. The bad news is that shallowness also makes the bay highly vulnerable to pollution. So a little bit of pollution can create big problems. And my favorite fun fact is that the bay was formed nearly 12,000 years ago when glaciers melted and flooded the Susquehanna River Valley. And the crater in the deepest portion of the bay was likely an asteroid that struck the Earth a very long time ago. So as I mentioned, the bay is a relatively shallow body of water and it's really susceptible to pollution. And I think it's important to touch upon the fact that a lot of that pollution is coming from the way that we have changed our landscapes over time. So Mother Nature put a perfect water treatment system into place. We had natural systems where we have trees which have leaves that can slow down rain as it's coming out of the sky. We have understory and other plants, as well as some deep roots that help to absorb nutrients and water and just slow all of that down. But most of us now live in suburban and urban areas where we've really created what we like to refer to as a gray funnel here at CBF. So we have created our cities and towns in a way where we don't like water to stick around too long because we don't want flooding to occur. So we have a lot of paved and hardened surfaces that are designed specifically to funnel water into stormwater drains and other access points where it can ultimately be deposited straight into a creek or stream, or it might go to a stormwater treatment facility where if you're in the city of Richmond, we have a combined sewer overflow system that if that system is too overwhelmed with water, it may still end up opening up the gates and releasing that water along with sewage straight into the river. So you can see there's a lot of problems that can occur with this type of system we've created. The two greatest sources of pollution that our waterways are dealing with today are sediment pollution, which refers to tiny particles of sand and clay that float in water that comes from erosion or exposed soil, as well as construction sites. And that can be problematic because it turns the water cloudy. It blocks out sunlight from reaching underwater grasses, which support the entire ecosystem. And once it settles to the bottom, it can smother animals that live there, like oysters and mussels. We also have nitrogen and phosphorus pollution to be concerned about, which are nutrients that are, of course, essential for the growth of all living organisms, but too much is also a bad thing. And those are coming from fertilizers, wastewater, septic tank discharges, air pollution, as well as runoff from farms. And it can be a problem because excessive levels are negatively impacting water quality. So I like this photo because it really does a good job of illustrating what happens when there's too much nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. Algae love that there's all of those nutrients in the water, and they'll thrive and grow really quickly when there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus present, but they'll create a thick mat across the surface of the water while they're using up all of that nutrients that are available. That thick mat will then block out the sunlight from reaching underwater grasses, which die off as a result. Then that algae will sink to the bottom once they've used up all the nutrients and will start decomposing. And the bacteria there work to decompose the algae, but they use up all of the oxygen that's available during that process, which then leaves no oxygen for fish and crabs and creates what we call dead zones. So you may hear in the news each year during the summer that there are some dead zones throughout the bay, and over time they can shrink or grow depending on how much pollution has been entering the waterways. So I also wanted to touch upon a couple of other factors that are influencing the health of our waterways as well as the bay itself. And they're directly tied to climate change. And I won't go too into depth in these because I could talk about them for quite a while. But rising temperatures have been a very big problem in our region. Warming water can be a problem because the warmer the water is, it can hold less oxygen. So I won't go too into depth on this topic, but that's the main takeaway. We, of course, also know that increased frequency and intensity of storms is a really big problem that we're facing throughout this region, as well as many other places in the world. So one of the most common effects that we've had is very severe storms where we're getting sudden large amounts of rain, which contributes to overwhelming stormwater systems, as I mentioned earlier. But it also means that a lot of sediment and nutrients wash off at one time and are dumped into our local waterways and eventually drain into the bay. And just to touch on some of the other issues that come with that, that increased amount of water can affect salinity levels, which of course affects all of the organisms that live in the waterways. It increases the loads of pollutants, and it also increases the risk of flooding in our neighborhoods. Many of you who live in Richmond itself are very familiar with the fact that we have a lot of flooding when we have heavy storms here. But down in the Hampton Roads region, we actually have folks who experienced increased risk of flooding even on sunny days because of the sea level rise that we're experiencing in this region. So you can see on this graph that at the Bay Tunnel is that point that's circled there. And we are at a 3 times higher than average risk of rising sea levels. And it's both due to rising water as well as our land is subsiding or sinking in this region because of the way that the glacial period impacted our lands. Those glaciers that are underneath of the land are kind of melting away and it's subsiding over time. So we have a double whammy that we're dealing with in the Hampton Roads area. So the state of the bay is CBF's way of measuring the health of our bay as well as the progress that's occurring every 2 years. We began tracking in 1998, and our scientists examine the best available historical and current information on 13 different indicators in 3 categories: pollution, habitat, and fisheries. And they assign a score between 1 and 100 to determine what the health is. And to put into context for you, a 100 on this scale is thinking of a theoretical, perfect pre-colonial times when the watershed population was only about 44,000 Native Americans. CBF, of course, recognizes that there's no way that we can achieve the water quality of the 17th century. The population of the Bay watershed today is over 18 million people. So our goal is to reach a 40 by 2025 on this scale, which would be a C+, and that would be a considerable achievement. And by 2030, we hope to reach a 50, which would be a B+. Ultimately, our goal is to reach a 70, which would be an A+, and that's when we would consider the bay to be fully restored. Excuse me. In 2020, our score was a 32, which is a D+, and it's actually a drop from the previous score in 2018, which was a 33. So you might be wondering why the score went down. And as I mentioned, we have 3 different indicators that we look at, and you can see here how those scores kind of broke apart over time. Nitrogen and phosphorus are obviously some big problems for us. We have a lot of pollutants still entering our waterways, especially as agriculture is a topic that can be sensitive in some states, particularly in Pennsylvania, where we have a lot of pollution washing off of agricultural lands. And thankfully, their legislation was able to create some cost share programs so that farmers can have assistance with putting some best management practices in place on farms to decrease the amount of pollution that is running off into waterways. Here in Virginia, we have historical amounts of funding to support agricultural BMPs, and our farmers are working really hard. But I always like to remind people that we are not blaming farmers for the pollution that comes from their fields. Many farmers are doing the best that they can and working with the situations that they have on family farms where they're trying to earn a living and keep their family farm running, that they really need that support from ag cost share programs to be able to put these best management practices in place. And they, of course, want their soil quality to stay healthy and productive over time. So if there's money available, they tend to be very receptive to putting practices in place. So we are seeing improvements over time. And our 2022 State of the Bay report is actually going to be released in a few weeks in the beginning of January. And I would suspect that we likely will see some slight improvements there because of the amount of funding that has been going towards reducing nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as sediments from agriculture. I want to be cautious of how much time I'm taking up, so I don't want to spend too long on this. But there are also some really great benefits that come from the work that is being done, that even though the score has gone down over time, we still see that there are reasons for optimism, because implementing the practices that states have put into their watershed implementation plans, which are an agreement between the 6 Bay states and the EPA on how they're going to work to reduce the pollutant loads. If they enact and follow those plans, we will see reductions in greenhouse gas emissions as well as in the pollutants entering our waterways. So we certainly have hope, and we are continuing to fight each day to make sure that those plans are being followed in each state and that the EPA is holding states accountable. So this slide just again shows how that process works, that there's a shared responsibility between each of the states, and there has been incremental pollution reduction goals over time. So we're coming up towards the end goal of 2025 and meeting all of the reductions that they initially set out towards. It's unlikely that we're going to see all of those goals met by 2025, and there likely will be an extension. So we'll see in the next 2 years where things go and what the EPA decides to do. But zooming in, I want to talk more about the James River itself, since we are here in Richmond. So taking a look back at the James River's health, by 1963, the James River was alarmingly polluted, and growing cities and major industrial and manufacturing centers were steadily making Virginia's environmental problems worse. Untreated chemicals and human waste were flowing freely into the river, and it was already amongst some of the most polluted rivers in the country at that time. By 1966, that environmental crisis became much more of a concern. If you're not familiar with Allied Chemical, they were a company located in Hopewell, which is about 30 minutes south of Richmond. And they were producing a chemical called ketone, which was a toxic pesticide and it was carcinogenic, and they were discharging it directly into the James River. The public wasn't aware that the chemical was flowing downstream and spreading throughout the lower James, and it began accumulating in the river sediments before making its way into plants and animals. As it moved up the food chain, it also increased in concentration, and it posed a really large threat to humans eating fish from the river. So in 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, which followed unprecedented support from the public for environmental protections as awareness grew around different issues with water and air. And after the Clean Water Act passed, there was a huge shift in the American culture and laws to protect waterways and our environment. Most notably, it was followed by the Clean Air Act as well as the Endangered Species Act. And unfortunately for us here in the James River watershed, while this was all happening, ketone was continuing to flow into the James River. So when ketone was finally discovered in the water near Hopewell, workers started to become ill from exposure to it since it was a toxin, and Virginia shut down production of the chemical, which made national headlines. And a few months later in 1975, a commercial fishery ban was placed on the James, and that moratorium continued for 13 years. Ketone breaks down really slowly. So after 13 years of the fishing industry being devastated, the James was considered one of the most polluted rivers in America. That ban was eventually lifted in 1988, and while there's still ketone in the river, it was buried low enough in the sediment that the concentrations had decreased drastically enough that it wasn't being found in plants and animals. So in the 90s, the James River Park System popularity began to rise, and people started recreating on the water more, and local officials began to view the river as an asset to the city. In 1997, the Water Quality Improvement Act was passed here in Virginia, which was intended to address sources of pollution to waterways like the James. And that legislation also provided funding to aid in cleaning up the river and putting pollution control measures in place throughout the watershed. Here you can see a photo from downtown. If you know where the kickstand is, you can see it underwater there. And this photo is a great example of how increasingly heavy and frequent storms have been hitting Virginia and flooding our region. Between May of 2018 and May of 2019, we had record rainfalls of more than 65 inches, which is 20 inches more than the yearly average. And all of that rain means that there's a lot of pollution washing off into the river. So our partners at the James River Association have a similar scorecard on how the James is doing as CBF does for the Bay. So in 2021, they ranked the overall health of the river at a B-. And you can see here that river restoration progress has been improving over time. Data since 2019 has shown that the heavy rainfalls we had during 2018 did have a really significant impact on the river, with sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus pollution increasing, which of course had a negative impact on pollution reduction goals. We also know that there are going to continue to be more extreme storms in the future, so we need to adopt stronger restoration goals and invest more in planting forested buffers along our streams, as well as improving urban stormwater treatment systems to handle those pollutant loads. And overall, the river health did rise by 1 point in the 2021 report. The river is showing signs of resilience despite those heavy storms, and it's bouncing back after surges in rainwater and pollution. So conservation and restoration efforts are making a difference overall in the grand scheme of things. And I just wanted to kind of leave off on thinking about the benefits of a healthy river and why this all matters. The James River is an important source of drinking water. 2.7 million people rely on the river for their water, which makes it Virginia's largest source of drinking water. In terms of seafood, like many other parts of Virginia and around the Bay region, we have a really large fish and shellfish industry here with more than 4.6 million pounds being caught in the James in 2020, which is worth over $14 million in value. The James is also home to some of the largest oyster reefs in the world, with over 754,000 pounds of oysters harvested in 2020. We also have some unique organisms here like sturgeon, which are endangered, that you're not going to see in every river. So they're very valuable to our ecosystem. We also have really high riverside park visitation. The James River Park System had over 6.2 million visitors in 2020, which is an increase from the 5 million in 2018. The park system saw visitation jump by 2 million people over the course of the pandemic from what we would normally see walking through the parks. So it's clear that it's a very valuable source of recreation and relaxation for people in our region. It also draws many tourists to our city since not many urban areas have such a wonderful park system. We also have a great deal of public access to the river here, which is unique to the James. There's 47 public access sites that have been added to the watershed since 2013. And we have over 500,000 people who are registered for boat and fishing licenses in the watershed in 2020. So it's clear that people truly care about these issues, even if they're not aware of how all of the pollution entering our waterways during storms is impacting their hobbies or their dependency on fishing to provide food for their families. So in summary, a healthy river will ultimately lead to a healthy bay because we really focus on the local level. Even though our mission may be to save the bay, we obviously can't see that as a one-off goal. In Pennsylvania, our staff are very focused on the Susquehanna River, and here in Richmond, we're very focused on the James River. We recognize that the work really needs to be done on an individual level, and over time, that will all build to a healthier watershed and to a restored bay. So with that, I will take any questions that people have. If I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
I'm just going to jump in for a sec and just put on my Henricopolis Soil and Water Conservation District hat and just connect the dot that the primary mission of Soil and Water Conservation Districts is to work with the agricultural producers, landowners, homeowners to install those best management practices and deploy that funding that the state provides to get those practices in place. So just wanted to connect that dot about our mission and how it interacts with Chesapeake Bay.
That's an excellent point. And I see in the chat that there's a question. The slide listed no-till cover crops as having a certain impact. Is there any indication of the improvement that may result from better lawn practices? And the answer to that is twofold. Yes, our primary focus when we think about better lawn practices is that by decreasing the need to mow or fertilize lawns, you're already reducing emissions from your property, as well as you're reducing the amount of pollutants that may be able to wash away from fertilizer use. But we also know that by removing turf grass, which is largely invasive and has a pretty high runoff coefficient rate, that it's very similar to asphalt in many places, with native plants, that they can establish deeper root systems, which will stabilize the sediment better. It'll be able to absorb nutrients better. And those native plants will also provide better habitat and food for other organisms to rely on, like pollinators. Meanwhile, lawn country, that people view them as something to be desired, that they picture a pretty green grass for their front yard. But in reality, it's a barren landscape from a habitat and ecological perspective. So it's not something to strive for if you want to see improvements in our ecosystem.
Gabby, when we were all first gathering on the line at the beginning of the meeting, Tyler indicated that he's a participant in a Chesapeake Bay Foundation program. And I had the opportunity to participate in the stewards of the Chesapeake Bay program with you several years ago. Are there still those engagement programs in place that folks can participate in?
Yes, we still do have our Voices program, which is what you participated in several years ago. And for anyone who is interested in that, it's generally a 6-week-long experience that it's one night per week for 2 to 3 hours that we have speakers who come in and cover different topics related to the Bay, James River health. My most recent class was much more focused on urban restoration and ecosystems, as well as environmental justice issues, and redlining and heat islands here in the Richmond area. So it changes from year to year what topics we cover, especially depending on where we're hosting the class, but it's a really great opportunity to become more educated on the topics, as well as to learn how to become a better advocate for the issues if you are passionate about that.
Wonderful. You're reading the question from Mark.
I am. Do you have some examples of citizen-led initiatives that are having significant impacts on improving the grade, oyster or grass restoration, for example? There are quite a few different citizen-led efforts. I will pick our oyster gardening program as a good example, that we have people who work with our relatively small oyster restoration team to grow baby oysters off of either their own properties, or they find public properties that are willing to have them attach cages with spat on shell there to grow oysters that then go back into the water as part of our restoration efforts to build reefs over time. We also have people in part of that work who transport shells from restaurants to be recycled. So they'll help with shoveling shells or transporting them from the restaurant to bins. And we store those on land for 6 months to make sure that we're not dumping shells back in the water that still have cocktail sauce on them. And then they're able to use those in that spat on shell process where baby oysters are referred to as spat, and they need to attach to a shell so that they can begin growing. So they recycle all of those shells and work to grow up those baby oysters for restoration purposes. So I think that's a really good example. And we have been able to replace millions of oysters in the bay through those programs. I see another question. To what extent is there an effort to enlist cooperation of agricultural areas upstream, especially west of the Blue Ridge? We do have a team at CBF of folks who are focused on working directly with farmers, and that's their entire job. So they work out in the Shenandoah Valley area. We also have staff in our Maryland and Pennsylvania offices who work with farmers. So they are working to assess their properties, connect them to sources of funding, help them with installing practices on their properties. So there is a great amount of effort put into that work and trying to educate farmers on what opportunities there are for them to receive funding so that they can improve their properties, not just for the sake of water quality, but for their own sake, so that they can protect the soil health on their farms and continue to be productive for future generations of their family to continue farming. I see a question, how successful are the oyster reef restorations where old oyster shells are dumped in the rivers? They've been very successful. We've established many reefs through those programs. So if you live in this region and you can't necessarily participate in growing the oysters, you can always participate in the oyster shell recycling piece of things to be a part of that pipeline towards rebuilding reefs. So if anybody is interested in that, I can always connect you with our oyster team so that you can find out how you can be part of the work. And I see HCAN is young, brand new, but our goal is to be a steady advocate and promoter of good, better, best practices and policies to better conserve and protect our land, air, and water. Is there a good example within the Bay watershed of similar groups or organizations that may be a little more mature? That's a really great question. And off the top of my head, it's difficult to name one particular group, but I will say that there are many citizen groups who have been very successful. And I think that one key word in there that I want to pull out is being a good advocate. We really need people to be those consistent advocates and reach out to their legislators to let them know that you're interested in these topics, that you want to see funding for water quality initiatives, that you want to see good policies move forward. And I always remind people that even if you don't feel that your legislator is going to agree with your stance on those issues, it's still important to make that phone call or send an email or meet them face to face and have those conversations, because sometimes they're just unaware of the issues, so you can help educate them. But even if they don't agree and they are aware of the issue, they still keep a record of each of those inputs that they receive from their constituents and how people want them to vote on different issues. And sometimes that can be the defining line of how they do end up voting in a committee meeting. And I will say, from being a part of the work here in Richmond during the General Assembly session, that people often assume that it's not worth their time to go set up a meeting or to make a phone call because there's so many other people who are doing that. And I'll say it's very surprising at times that it doesn't take that many people. You could be one of the loudest voices in the room because there's only a couple of people who are actually speaking about that issue. So your voice could have a big impact on how they choose to vote on a particular topic. So I will shout it from the rooftops that if you have the time or opportunity to send an email or a phone call, that's wonderful. If you can meet with your legislator and develop a relationship with them, that's always the top goal that we work people towards. And many people find that to be an intimidating process and feel like they're too important for me to meet with. And I can say from sitting in many rooms with legislators, they are just another human like you and me, and you should not be intimidated of them. They're there to work for us. So I encourage you to meet with them if you have not before. And during the General Assembly session can be a really great time to do that. There's some different groups who will organize lobby days so that you don't have to go alone if you don't want to for your first time. CBF hosts lobby days that you can always feel free to reach out to me. And our partners at the Virginia Conservation Network also host a really large lobby day for conservation-minded people to come meet, hear about the topics, and then go over together to lobby as a group. So I encourage anybody who is interested in advocacy to participate in some of that work. I see a question about CBF's input on omega menhaden harvesting and the process within the Bay and its tributaries. That can be a very sensitive topic, and I'll say that the latest news related to regulations surrounding menhaden harvesting were something that CBF was disappointed in, that there weren't stronger regulations put in place for some seine net harvesting of menhaden in the Bay. If you're interested in some more in-depth information on that topic, I would be happy to connect you with our staff scientist, Chris Moore, who has worked on menhaden issues for close to 2 decades now and is very well versed in the topic, and would love to chat with you if you have some more in-depth questions related to that, but I'll kind of leave it at that top level. Are there any other questions?
Gabby, there was one that popped in a little bit before that last question. John mentioned that HCAN wants to mimic some of the state level work at the local level. And hopefully CBF can help us identify ideas and policies that we can push for at the local level.
Yeah, I would love to assist with that work. I personally live in Henrico and I work here in Richmond, so I'm certainly interested in what's happening on the local level. And we, excuse me, are often asking for advocates to be more engaged on that hyper local level because we don't have the capacity to do that work. Our grassroots team here in Virginia is 3 people. So you can imagine how tough it is for us to know what's going on in every locality throughout the state and to have the capacity to be a part of that. So I would love to help in any way that I can with that work as you all move forward.
Wonderful, thank you. Are there any other questions for Gabby tonight? Well, if not, I just want to thank you so much for being here. I was having flashbacks to the Voices program and just how fascinating, how crammed with data your slides are and how fascinating it all is. It really tells a tremendous story. And I hope that we all really take to heart your comments about consistent advocacy, because that really should be our number one takeaway tonight. So thank you so much for that. And we really do appreciate your being here. I see that Aileen has been dropping some links in the chat for how to get more involved with Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So please take a look at the chat and see those links to some of their programming and other opportunities.
And I just wanted to say thank you all for being here tonight and for listening to me. I do have a lot of information crammed into these slides, so I will send them to Tim and he can share them out with the group so that you can take more of an in-depth look. It's tough to get all of the information into a 20 to 30 minute session. So if anybody has any questions that they think of later, my contact information is on there and I'm always happy to chat. So feel free to reach out with anything that you think of.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Gabby. We really appreciate your being here.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. I'll pass the information around. I appreciate it.
Fantastic. Well, before we say goodnight, I will just give a reminder that our January meeting is on the 17th about conservation maps. And we'll be moving to an every other month meeting schedule in 2023. It will be a little more manageable, especially as committees start doing more work, and will help people balance committee work with the presentation meetings. So with that, I'll ask Lynn if you'd like to add before we close out tonight.
Just thank you, everybody. I think it's been an incredible 2022. None of us would have been together or even seen that this would be a possibility just last year this time. And just, with things like the meetings with the Board of Supervisors around climate and educating ourselves about the wonderful resources in our community, learning about the comprehensive plan and how to participate in all of that. Congratulations to everybody for really helping to make a stronger focus on conservation across our county, because so much does happen at the local level. And this is long overdue. So thank you all so very much for a great 2022. Looking forward to a good year. Rest up.
And happy holidays, everyone. See you in January.
Bye-bye all. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Lynn, are you staying?
I can
Lynn,
stay.
Tim, Anne, and Marie.
The board usually sticks around a little while just to process what we've done.